So, hi, I'm John Atack, and this is my great friend Yuval Laor. And I wanted to talk about what sparked your interest, what led to the theory of or belief fervor that you've put forward. What kickstarted it?
That I'm writing a book about now.
Well, it's good. Let's get the promotion in for the book straight away.
Well, the future book, yeah.
The future book. You can write postulate checks.
The current working title is Fervor, with a subtitle, What Cults Can Teach Us About the Evolution of Religion, but it might turn into What Scientology Can Teach Us into evolution. But I think cults right now. But anyway, Fervor, spelled the way it's spelled wherever you are,
yes.
with the U or without
the U,
yeah.
Okay, and
yeah.
What sparked your interest at the
it took a few accidents, because it's a strange field. In general, it's a field that it's very ambitious, right?
Yeah.
To talk about, and it barges in on the intellectual, territory of many different people.
Mm-hmm.
The way the everything started, there's two just lucky accidents to start with. So the first one was me accidentally becoming obsessed with cults and reading about cults, mostly Scientology, but that's also an accident. So I first heard about Scientology in high school here in Boulder, Colorado. So I was an immigrant here in high school. And a friend of mine showed me some Scientology brochures and told me about his experiences going to the Scientology, thing here in Boulder, which used to exist. This is around the time that the Time magazine with Scientology on the cover came out. This would be 1991 or so.
I'm not sure. I wasn't in Boulder in 1991 thinking about it. I think I might have been. So there you go. We were all there at the same time.
Yeah, I was in high school. I was just 6'4" back then. At the time, I was curious about Scientology because my friend was, telling me interesting stuff. He was also curious, but he was a step ahead. I assume he never went in, because I remember seeing that Time magazine in his parents' house. So I assume that they read it.
By Rich Behar.
Yeah. And a great article it is.
It is.
But I remember him telling me stuff like truth is what is true for you and stuff like that. When you're 16, or it just sounds more profound than it should.
No. Dan's just saying it's like how you can justify being Hitler, because it's like when Tony Blair said of the Iraq War, I believed at the time. You're a lawyer, mate. How many people have you seen get off before a judge going, I believed at the time that breaking into the house was the right thing to do?
So my instincts were to stay away. And those were the correct instincts. But I didn't know it at the time, and I remember being interested in it. And so in 1997, I moved back to Israel. I'm now that by then I'm in graduate school, and I remember there was that Scientology thing. I remember the brochures, right, with all the Sea Org members, and the brochures with the swords and the uniforms.
Swords. Sorry.
You know the brochure. You know those pictures.
I do. Yeah, you've used one of them with the woman holding up a sword. It's like sailors with swords. It's like, what am I looking at? This looks like a pulp novel from the 1940s.
Yeah,
it is.
When you're in high school, swords are cool, I guess. So I decided to go on the internet and look up what the hell was that thing. Was that Scientology? And so this would be 1997, and I remember Xenu.net being, the first thing that came up.
And Andreas Havelunt, the great,
Yeah.
remarkable.
And I thanked him when I met him in
Yeah.
Toronto.
Yeah.
And there was Mark Bunker putting XenuTV.net with a lot of videos and interviews of former members. And I was just, first of all, I was shocked, right? That such a thing can exist, such a thing does exist. It's still going on. There was live news was happening. There's all sorts of dramatic events with Tori Bezezian leaving Scientology, and she's embraced by people at the airport, and right there's like, yeah,
Magoo.
That's right. Magoo, 44 or something, yeah. And so, I'm following all of that. I'm not really communicating with people. I'm a lurker, as they say, but I am, riveted to this drama, and just what the hell is going on with this? There's and the stories are first of all, there's so much detail. There's so much, as you said, there's so many different techniques and different stuff that people do. And by then you start getting books about, life in Scientology and the Sea Org, The Road to Xenu and others.
Marjorie Wakefield's excellent book
about and others, probably forgetting people that need credit. I read your book, which I have over there.
Good.
Yeah.
There will be an examination.
Yeah. And so that's the first, thing. So I walk around, and the next accidental thing that happened to end up with me writing a book about the evolution of our capacity for fervor was me taking a class about evolution by Professor Eva Jablonka, who's a good friend of mine now and was my thesis advisors for both a master's degree and a PhD. And so I take her class. The class was called Evolution in Four Dimensions, which is the name of the book. Here, I'll plug the book, just a second.
No, we have it. We'll put a picture of it on the screen. Don't worry.
And it's very good and very readable. And there's pictures, and there's a dialogue at the end of each chapter that they wrote. So, yeah.
Even act it out, the last bit, with your own
yeah. So she's giving this class before publishing the book, right? So it was a seminar. So we're reading chapters for every week. We read a chapter, and she sees, tests it out before getting published. But what I learned is that I thought I knew about evolution, but it turns out that I didn't. So evolution is a subject, like economics, I would guess, that a lot of people think that they know.
Yeah.
They know what it's about. More than people, more than they deserve. So a lot of people think that they know, evolution, that's survival of the fittest, right? That's,
as Herbert Spencer said.
Yeah.
Or it's Richard Dawkins, to be more recent.
So random variation and selection, but as
voracious
they say,
beings that have great appetites and are selfish about themselves.
Yeah. So and when it comes to the selfish gene, Richard Dawkins will tell you, well, the selfish was a metaphor, but biologists today will tell you, well, actually, the gene is a metaphor as well, because we don't know. There's no single definition of what a gene is. It's certainly not a replicator.
And to try and identify any kind of self into a gene at any rate is what?
Well, the assumption is that they're replicators, but they're not. And the DNA is a read-write system. It's not a read-only system. And the mutations are not random. That's they say early on. They're not random, not in place. There's places on the genome that not in time, because when times are bad, animals and plants
Genetic change.
they mutate much more. Not in size. There's certain size of mutation. It's turns out that this story of replicators is and mutation is and the sources of variation are and the so what I learned in this class and from this book is the Evo-Devo, which is evolutionary developmental biology, way of thinking about evolution, right? So in the Evo-Devo approach, it's called evolutionary developmental because it assumes that how the evolutionary change, right? So change of an animal over centuries or, millennia, and a personal change, how you change from a baby to you or from a zygote to you, that those two types of changes are actually not independent from each other. So the Darwin didn't think they were independent, but August Weismann, the second biggest biologist of the 19th century, he's the one that separates the evolutionary change and the developmental change. And that separation becomes more and more strict until the 70s, when people like Richard Dawkins really try to separate them completely. But in evolutionary developmental theory, the realization is that those are not independent from each other. That there's you have so development gives you all sorts of stuff like plasticity, right? So plasticity is the opposite of a trait, but it's also a trait itself, right? So you have selection for increased plasticity and for decreased plasticity, right? So it's not selecting for a trait; it's selecting to let development determine the trait, right? So, right, the same DNA can give you a fat person or a thin person, right? Depending on childhood nutrition, a tall person or a short person, right? Development really affects everything.
Yes.
And those things affect selection, right? So the assumption that for example, culture and genes are independent variables. So you can have cultural evolution and genetic evolution as separate types of evolution. That doesn't work. We cannot do that because those are not independent variables. You cannot do the all else being equal question. All else being equal, let's change the genes, and but all else would not be equal. All else would be. So the reason this is called evolution in 4 dimensions, because it's it's not 4 types of evolution, it's 4 modes of inheritance. So there's genetic inheritance, epigenetic inheritance, which is behavioral inheritance, and symbolic inheritance. And all of those inheritances interact. And they interact in a way that brings us a single phenotype, which is the animal, right? And that animal is selected, right? So this brings back Lamarckian type of arguments. So it was very popular in the 70s and 80s to just laugh at Lamarck. Lamarck is before Darwin, as an evolutionary theorist.
I've read Koestler's book about him.
Yeah.
So Case of the Midwife Toad.
Yeah, I haven't read that, but
Paul Camera, very fascinating book.
I'm sure. So people who wanted to make fun of Lamarck, they say, "Oh, Lamarck says that what we do in our life affects our children. So if you cut off your hand, then your child, might be born with a smaller hand, or or something, or without a hand." But that's silly, of course.
Sympathetic magic of one sort or another, yeah.
But Lamarck didn't, he didn't, you don't need to take it that direction. You can say, well, if you cut your hand, then your selection would be different. You might be less successful in life. with less hands.
Mm.
You might mate with someone different than you would. You might be poorer. Your child might not have as good nutrition.
Yes.
So the cutting of the hand will affect your genes, just not directly,
Yeah.
right? So a good example for how evolutionary thinking in an Evo-Devo context happens is talking about literacy, right? Because that's an example where culture can be a leader in evolution, right? So back in the 70s, people told us that the real evolution is genes, and then culture is just the foam on the waves of the genes, right? It's the genes hold culture on the leash, right? It's the genes that matter, and they change slowly, and then the culture that doesn't matter, and that changes quickly. But that so that was the evolutionary psychology with a big E and a big P
Mm.
assumption, and that falls apart. um, so if we look uh, at literacy, we see that we have a physical part of our brain that does literacy, right? 94% of the people, it's on the left side of the brain, but 6% it's on the right side of the brain. And if you get damaged in that part of the brain, you can't do literacy anymore. And we see that things like dyslexia runs in families, right? So if a Martian would come down and he would look at a group of 100 people, and they all have this literacy part of their brain, it's very, very useful. Dyslexia runs in families. It would look like an evolved, selected for trait.
Mm.
But we actually know that it's not. It's a technology. It's a way for culture to arrange elements in the evolutionary toolbox, which are fine motor control, certain kind of vision, certain kind of language, certain kind of memory. And in development, right, that interacts with the work of ancient people from whatever thousands of years ago that invented literacy, right?
Mm.
So you need both people centuries ago to invent it. You need someone in your personal past to have taught you literacy.
Yeah.
And at the end, you get this part of the brain that can really affect selection.
Mm.
Can really change what you can do and you can't do. And as such, you can read books about how to do things once you have literacy. But we know that the difference between literate people and illiterate people is a difference in culture.
Mm.
But you do need genes for literacy. If you don't have genes to make eyes, you'll not be, or brains or memories. Literacy needs a lot of genes. But the difference that makes a difference is not a genetic difference, but a cultural difference. Um, so this kind of
There isn't a
evolution.
literacy module that's been activated.
Well, there is, but it's not innate.
Yeah.
It's a developed module. So
Yeah.
once you switch the metaphor of the module from the Swiss Army knife to the hand as the metaphor for our mind, it's the tool that can do other tools, but it's still limited in the ways it's limited. In this kind of evolutionary thinking, so for example, if you take the evolution of language,
Mm.
which is a big topic. An argument by Eva Jablonka and Daniel Dor about the evolution of language was that it started out as a technology, just like literacy is today, but then it was selected for. And when it was selected for, it underwent what's called genetic assimilation. So what the selection was determined by language, right? But that selection affected the genes, which genes will interact with which. So if you had stuff like positive assortative mating, where the people who are really good at talking were mating with each other, or that they had a better chance of survival, and therefore they mated with each other because they're the only ones that survive. That could, with time, lead to animals that it's easier and easier for them to acquire language, right? So we ended up being peculiarly good at it. But it still requires culture, right? So this evolution language is what that kind of evolutionary thinking, it can explain, I think, in a way that's much more plausible than, like Yuval Laor in his book *Sapiens* says, well, one day there was a mutation, and then a gene changed and we started talking. So stuff like that seems bizarre, but in an evo-devo context, I think it's with stuff like genetic assimilation, which is a concept from the 50s by Waddington. So in this kind of evolutionary thinking is really, really different than the kind of evolutionary thinking that I thought I knew about. So those are the two big elements. First, learning how that cults are fascinating, and then that you need to if you want to think about things from an evolutionary perspective, then then look to evo-devo and forget other
modularism
things.
and the
modularism, or there's mimetics, or it's more complex, more sophisticated cousin, the epidemiology of representations, and those are about the transmission of ideas, but also those ideas are not independent variables. You cannot you cannot do the all else being equal argument. If you look at a trait like, for example, alcohol consumption, right? So alcohol consumption is affected by all four modes of inheritance, right? So if you have the genes of certain, Asian and Native American populations, you react to alcohol differently. There's epigenetic considerations. So if your mother drank alcohol while you're a fetus, you will react to alcohol differently. There's also cultural, behavioral, and symbolic, and also ecological, right? So if there's an alcoholic beverage factory in your town, that might affect your alcohol consumption. But of course, cultural, if you're a devout Muslim, if you're a fraternity member, you drink more, you drink less. But at the end, all four of those modes of inheritance interact to give you a single trait of alcohol consumption, which strongly affects your selection, right? Whether you'll die in a car accident, in a fight, who you'll have sex with.
By setting your beard on fire and not being able to move. Vivian Stanshall, by the way.
Or you might father children, that that you wouldn't without alcohol.
Is that what happened?
Or mother children, yeah. So to say that let's do the argument. What would French drinking culture be if everybody had the genes of Native Americans rather than French people? But nothing would be the same. It's not like you can keep everything the same and change one of the elements, because they all are, and the DNA doesn't really determine. I mean, the same DNA makes a bee and a queen bee, and those are radically different looking animals. It's the same DNA. There's no genetic difference between those. I mean, it's a queen ant and an ant. So the whole story of biology, inheritance, evolution is a very different story.
Absolutely.
I
mean, in my small grasp of these ideas, it to me has been very significant in the last 5 years to realign. I mean, I came from a Lamarckian lilt into reading Stephen Jay Gould. I wrote a book of essays called Ever Since Darwin, which are excellent. Gould was such a fine writer, and marshaled his facts so well. I read his book about IQ, where he's completely dismissing this idea of measuring this stuff that nobody knows what it is. You know, which seems like and he gave the Army Alpha to his grad students, and they were all morons because they didn't recognize the wind-up gramophone. And of course, the Army Alpha was done in English, even if you were Polish or spoke Yiddish. You know, it's like, which is how come the Jews and the Poles got to the bottom of the IQ band, and less were allowed in as immigrants. There would have been more Jews allowed in if the test had been given in a language they could speak.
You know, those pesky, yeah. I once I wrote an article, and I sent it to be, you know, reviewed before publication. And somewhere in the article, I talked about this was about the, you know, evolutionary stuff, and I mentioned intelligence, and the article comes back saying, well, we don't really know what that is, and it's a term that is hard to define, and you know, so I switched it to the ability to figure things out, and and that's how it got published.
Oh dear, that's great.
With
what was it in particular about the cults? What was it in particular about Scientology that fascinated you?
Well, I mean, Scientology is endlessly fascinating. First of all, I think that the fact that I was, you know, a little bit seduced by the idea of going there. I mean, I never even went once, you know. But I remember
that's just because you're incredibly lazy, though. Let's face it.
Maybe, yeah. I probably couldn't drive, but you know, still. But the and I knew that my parents are not gonna be happy about me going to, yeah. And just the fact that adult people can join a group and start doing strange stuff, you know, screaming at ashtrays, you know, signing $1 billion-year contracts. And, you know, I hear that after the first 200 million years, you know, you get used to it. So it's not
as bad as it seems.
It's not as bad as the whole billion years, you know.
Working a 90-hour week as a slave.
Yeah. And 90 is on the low end. Yeah.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
Yeah. So the just the fact that it can happen, and I felt that, you know, I could probably get into that. So I was curious, but so I'm taking this class about evolution. I'm interested about this kind of stuff, and I have here this book that I read, you know, accidentally. A friend of mine recommended it, and then. So this is Julian Jaynes, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. I see it in mirror image. So. And I read this book, and it has an evolutionary, you know, narrative, and it talks about the evolution, you know, how we hear voices. It's a great book and very well written. It's a little outdated. It's from 1976, and I read it. I was, you know, very interested, and I asked my professor if she heard, you know, if she read this book. So she told me that she heard about it, but she never read it, if I can lend it to her, right? So I gave it to Eva on Tuesday, and then I saw her again on a Thursday, and she handed it back to me saying it was very good.
How long is it? How many pages?
Well, I have here with the after. It's like 400 pages.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. It's 450. But and then she told me that she thinks that there's a problem with the book because he doesn't know about theory of mind. So theory of mind is a concept which comes around in the 80s, mostly, I think 87. And theory of mind, it's not a theory. It's the ability to have a theory in your mind that someone else has a mind. So you know that someone else knows things and might, you know. So once you have theory of mind, you can lie, because you can once you're 3, 4, 5 years old, you know that there's a version of the world, and then there's the version of the world in mom's head, right? So in the real world, there's no longer any chocolate, but in mom's head, there still is, because she doesn't know that. So the theory of mind and which animals have it, and etc., and knowing that you are an animal like other animals. Um, and that was very relevant to the theory of presented by Julian Jaynes, but he didn't know about it. So that was so I had an idea, maybe I'll write, my seminar about that. So then I went and started reading the books about the evolution of religiosity, or evolution of religion, they call it, but it's the capacity for religion. It's not how religion changes, which is another, there's a thing, evolution of religion in that context. But and part of it in the background is me trying, maybe here I'll understand what the hell was going on with
Yeah.
Scientology and other
I will
cults.
become enlightened. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe these, and so here I'll bring some more books to show. Just a second.
Surely.
So start reading books like this, right? How Religion Works.
Yeah.
Which is actually not bad. I learned a lot. There's The Evolution of Religion, right?
Yep.
If people want, and
Straight
stuff.
through of Darwin as God on the front.
Yeah, Darwin loves you. And look at this, Religion Explained, right?
Away.
And the evolutionary origins of religious thought. So I'm
I have a
sure
copy of that, but I didn't manage to finish it, I must say.
Yeah, well, so I'm reading these books, and at first I think I will religion is explained, right? And what I find out is not only that they completely ignore cults, and these are all books in what is called the cognitive science of religion, right? So the evolution of religion is a collection of articles. So that's 50 different articles. So that might be more varied. And I'm not picking on these. I have a lot more books in the cognitive science of religion. It's just that with the title "Religion Explained," it's just
can, in fact, online log into your list of books.
Yeah.
That's public information.
Yeah, there you go.
I know you haven't read many of them, but it looks impressive.
Yeah. Well, it's. But I did read these.
Yeah.
So the paradigm that these are based on, the evolutionary paradigm, is the epidemiology of representations. Mm-hmm. So in Religion Explained, for example, he would ask what makes religious representations, which a representation, it's like the story of Little Red Riding Hood, but it's sort of like a meme in Richard Dawkins' memetics context, which is something that replicates, but he knows that my version of Little Red Riding Hood in my head and your version are not the same. It's not that it was replicated, but there's an attractor there that that they
I've seen Don't Look Now. My representation of Little Red Riding Hood is terrifying.
Yeah, that's a good movie. So in this context, cults and in general, it assumes that you can separate representations, ideas, from other environmental and cultural and biological aspects. Yep. Right? So it's like in memetics, where they say, well, the meme replicates. Yeah, but if I hear the same sentence being said by the Pope or by a drunk guy, or when I'm drunk, or when I
when I'm the Pope,
when all those things matter, and they're not independent variables. And if you ask someone who believes in the epidemiology of representations or in memetics, why is England Protestant rather than Catholic, they might say, well, the Protestant memes were fighting the Catholic memes. Well, any historians will tell you, yeah,
guys, never was so much.
Yeah. If you ask a historian, tell you, yeah, well, it's because Bloody Mary died, of influenza. That's why they're Protestant. It's because authority and politics, and it's a political decision what people would have in their minds. So
Yeah.
this idea that we can do an all else being equal and arguments and think that representations or memes or ideas or culture are can be thought of independently
Mm.
from other factors just doesn't work. And at the end you end up with people who don't realize that first of all you can believe in something without knowing what it is. So you can believe in the Bible without knowing what's in the Bible, and you can ignore the central things of your religion. So you can you can be a Christian and not give all your money to the poor, not turn the other cheek. I know it sounds
Not carry your own cross. That's
yeah.
No.
So there's people who would say, Muslims are all homophobic because it says so in their texts.
They will push you off the top of a mountain if they find out you're gay. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what it says to do, and it's like, but the Al Qaeda, Daesh were apparently doing that, but it's not a general principle
and
about the Muslim.
You can ignore if a Christian, a devout Christian, can ignore the most central things, and it's really important to be able to ignore the things that you believe in the most. If you believe that God will provide, if you believe him, you must not act on that belief, because you will not be provided for.
Have no thought for the morrow.
Yeah.
So because somebody else will go out and work so that you can eat.
Yeah. So the relying on problematic assumptions regarding evolution leads you to say stuff that people that know history of religion or religion would know is that's not how religion works, right?
No.
So I'm reading those books, and another important thing is that these books and the writers of them usually come from the psychology and psychology of religion and sociology of religion and maybe religious studies and cognitive science. But in those fields, you can ignore extreme cases. If you want to know about religion and you ask a psychologist of religion, they can ignore cults. They can say, cults, that's an anecdote. That's rare. Religious experiences, sudden conversion. You can be religious without experiences. You can be religious without having converted. So it's not essential, and we can ignore that, right? But I know, or not I come from, my advisor is an evolutionary theorist. I know you cannot ignore extreme cases. If you find one cat that can breathe underwater, if you find
one dog that can, that's all it takes.
You're not going to say that's just an anecdote. You're going to say, well, I guess we have to rethink, a lot of stuff. So
one person who can prove they reincarnated, one person who can speak the language of Rome.
The
time of Caesar.
So I know that stuff that happens in Scientology, or the sudden conversion, the way people can change their life when they join Scientology, that even though no matter how rare it is, should be really something we pay attention to if we're going to talk about things from an evolutionary perspective. So I'm disappointed by books that fail to recognize that extreme cases are actually very important. So with that, and learning more and more about religion, and I did learn a lot from these books, right? There is a lot to know about. Psychology, sociology of religion. And religious studies, anthropology of religion, and all those. But realizing that they are basing their arguments on evolutionary assumptions that I disagree with, gave me the courage and the ambition to maybe I'll be able to say something about such a, such a topic, because I learned that Evo Devo teaches you that there's other ways to think about evolution.
And that it's a more satisfying way to think about it too. It fits together, and there's something strangely comfortable about it. Whereas the sort of Hitlerian interpretation of Darwin left us all feeling a little bit, and thinking that evolution would lead to eugenics, that there would be some way of controlling this without kind of rich interchanges that happen between people, and the effect that we have probably through the way we are emotionally, that if we are kind of crazy, angry people, that too will affect what comes after. It will affect what comes after,
and what selection pressures we are we are going to be exposed to if we fight people at the bar all the time, if we
so it's a good teaching in how to live without becoming judgmental and saying you'll go to hell if you don't do this. That we might as well,
or that you are inferior or superior. Nazism presented itself as applied biology, as an exact science. Nazism presented itself,
and Stalin was applying economics.
Which also economics at the time was considered by them to be an exact science. So.
And we saw what Lysenko did in the Soviet Union. Brilliant scientist.
There's similar things happening in the West as well for a little short time in the 50s.
I don't think they killed all the senior engineers in a 1-year period, though, did they?
No.
I think Stalin's a champion for that kind of murder. Just amazing that idea of reordering society by killing thousands of people who have expertise. So, the Red Army going to battle against Hitler, having lost half of its officer corps in the 1938 purge.
Or
huge amount of people just killed.
And
Mao had invented the purge, and Stalin learned it from him.
And it's it's all in the mindset of accelerating evolution. We're going to get to that communist utopia no matter what we do, or at Nazism, we'll get to that biological utopia. We're just, making it so we'll get there earlier, because that's inevitable that we'll get there anyway. So and
the misunderstanding that eugenics, that, the way they understood it, that they could wipe out part of the population. They could, and I believe you said that the mental health and such statistics in Germany are the same now as they were before the T4 program. So killing 180,000 people and sterilizing who knows how many.
And if you look at the history's geniuses, many of them had direct relatives which suffered from mental illness. Kant, Einstein, a lot of so genius and mental illness come together. So eradicating all the mentally ill and it's not good.
Certainly not good. People maybe, but
so I guess if I'll take another the final step that ended up with those lectures on fervor that you so kindly recorded in your studio, was the abandonment of the title of evolution and religion. So when it comes to evolution, I was stuck with evolution, because even though if I would say evolution of religion in the title of a talk, so I actually gave a talk to my department about the evolution of religion, and people there were all veterans of the science wars in the 1990s, and the science wars are called wars because they were not friendly intellectual exchanges. and there's a lot of criticism about evolutionary theories trying to explain cultural stuff, right? So there was a time where there's a lot of people in the humanities would hear evolution and they would assume that I'm talking about the selfish gene, or talking about, I think the God delusion came out recently. And so they were immediately, pissed off about, what is he gonna, and religion, that might be the most contested concept of in history, so so with evolution, I was stuck with having to explain that I'm talking about evolution there differently. But with religion, I managed to sidestep the whole concept of religion by saying, oh, I'm talking about cults. So now cults are extremely controversial, and what the hell is that? And there's, as you know, there's many definitions and arguments, and some better than others.
Some more accurate than others too.
Yeah.
A cult is a devotion to a particular person or thing. It can be a doctrine, and that's the Oxford Dictionary definition from 1711, first usage recorded, which had not been amended in any way in the 1977 edition. The word after that acquired a pejorative meaning in the English language. In the American language, it first started to twist its meaning at the end of the 19th century in a dictionary. And it instead of saying it's a good cult, it's devoted to the Red Cross. Yeah. It's devoted to helping people, whatever, or a bad cult. Or can we agree on Charlie Manson's family being a bad cult? Is anybody in the religious field going to be upset if I talk about
the People's Temple? Yeah,
I'm sorry.
The People's Temple. That's the
Order of the Solar Temple, the movement, the restoration of the Ten Commandments.
Yeah. Well, the People's Temple, right? You got people, you got a temple, but those are the guys that committed suicide in 1978 in Guyana. Yeah.
The African movement for the restoration was in 2000, and there were 500 of them.
Yeah.
You got Waco, and then you Solar Temple, all of these, and the Heaven's Gate, the Bo Peep cults.
So, in a way, I do talk more about cults, but in a way I could present my argument even as, any theory about the evolution of religious psychology needs to be compatible with the fact that things like Scientology exist, right? So I don't even need to define cults. I don't even need to define,
just upset David Miscavige, get on with it.
Yeah. And
you go after Richard Dawkins as well, you're bound to stir up some controversy.
Yeah.
Richard Dawkins actually did, and this is true, it's in one of his books, he called Scientology a major religion. This was at a time when it certainly had less than 100,000 members.
Wow.
So I think he's secretly working for them, promoting.
Yeah.
I don't think 25,000 members really qualifies you as a major anything. Not even a major American football club.
And they're not that much of a religion now. I know they do Sunday services when they wanted to get the IRS, tax exemption. But anyway,
I think that started in the UK at St. Hill because there's a chapel there, which was consecrated as a chapel. They wanted to. And so for years, I was there during the period this was happening. And in the 60s, they first made their petition. And Lord Denning, our most famous judge of the period, said that to be a religion, you would have to have worship. And unless it was true that Scientologists worshipped Ron Hubbard, then they were not a religion. And so he ruled against them getting the tax exemption. And these, I think, were property taxes they were trying to get out of. Because it's quite, tens of acres of ground down there. You have to pay money on it. And they kept going. And every Sunday, there'd be a chaplain giving a service. And there would be nobody else in the room. Year in, year out. I never once attended one of those services. In fact, the only service I can remember attending was a wedding, which of course was just a blessing or whatever you'd call it afterwards. That was it. 9 years. So, but they made the services. They did all of that, which is another part of what makes it fascinating. Because I said Potemkin village before about the middle of Clearwater, but it is a sort of Potemkin village, Scientology, because it's seeking to be seen as this religion as this world saving. It has educational techniques, business techniques, therapy that will sort you out completely. You can become super literate. It's one of the things they promise in their literature. I was talking to Bonnie Woods earlier today, and she said it was weird because she did what would become called the primary rundown, and you listen to all of these tapes by Hubbard, dozen or so tapes, and then you have transcripts, and you have to word clear every word. Every time you come to a "the," you have to go and look it up again. You have to do it 3 times through.
Wow.
Right? I remember people coming, at St. Hill who were doing it, looking as if somebody had strained them, and their brains, like a sponge, were trying to reassemble. It just became so oppressive by that 3rd time through. Thankfully, I never did the Method 9 course. But she said the funny thing is that since doing it, her reading speed really went up. and she presumes it's some kind of hypnotic effect that resulted, but who knows? It doesn't matter if something dangerous does you good. That's going to happen too sometimes.
Yeah.
But she then admitted that it means she doesn't absorb the material in the same way. So she can find a piece of information in a text very quickly by skim reading skills, one presumes. But she doesn't come away knowing what's been said, if you like. So it sounded for a moment as if I was going to say that Scientology worked, but I didn't end up saying that. So that's progress as well.
But so the Scientology, I guess you could call it a religion. In a way, you can say that they do worship L. Ron Hubbard. But all those definitions.
But it's a religion here now. You don't have to worship anything anymore.
Now, if
religion is gone.
For people who already saw the my presentation on or heard me talk about it, know that I equate between the psychology of fervor and the psychology of infatuated love. And in a way, focusing on cults is rather than religion. So if religion would be the category of loving relationships, right, or the psychology of love, or the psychology of shares a lot with the psychology of religion, the way you love your grandparents, which you meet every few months, and you love them, but you could look at that kind of love. But I think that you can learn more about the psychology of love by looking at abusive relationships, about someone who stays with a partner even though it's a horrific situation. And so cults are the abusive relationship, right? So looking at religious psychology and saying that even cults can exist. Now, I realize that is not a typical, analyzing love by looking at abusive relationships might give you a distorted vision of what love is. But I do think that it is an important part of what love is, and it is, in a way, an aspect of love that is neglected in some presentations of the material.
And if you take the word love and translate it back into what Bowlby insisted on in the end, attachment.
Attachment.
It also makes sense that why do we attach to certain people, and why do we remain attached to them?
And the nature of the attachment that can maintain through an abusive situation and both an abusive relationship, romantic relationship, and also in cults, you have the situation where the worse the abuse is. Sometimes you get a situation where the worse the abuse is, the less likely people are to leave the situation,
well, if you look
which is very counterintuitive.
Look at the White Knights, the practices for the mass murder at Jonestown. that they were, the sirens were set off, they were woken up, they had to go out and just automatically drink the flavor aid. Let's get our advertising right here, guys. Poor Kool-Aid actually knocked off the market by a rival product that was actually used as instrumental in the deaths of 911 people. But they were freaked out. They were pushed into a situation of traumatic stress, so they'd respond in a certain way. Just sleep deprivation. Just sleep deprivation, and you
that
can
would be sufficient. But there was a lot more than that going on, and isolation, actual physical isolation. I'm sure they weren't the healthiest. Their nutrition wasn't very good. It's
the things I've heard, the tales I've heard. I mean, Aftermath has done great work in showing those things. I wish they'd got into how to help people that have suffered from it, because it would have made my task going from one to another much simpler if they'd reached millions with it. But nonetheless, these terrible events that occur to people, and sort of, you have to look at them one at a time. You have to say, well, what did happen? And after about the 500th account from somebody who's been involved in it, and seeing how they all fit together, there are a couple of people who told me things, and I've just decided they were schizophrenics, and that this is something that happened in their world, and bless them. But most everything I gathered, I was able to check and cross-reference, and you start finding that the meat of the material is in what Hubbard himself said. But you have to look at it from a different perspective, not from the perspective of, I'm going to read this because it's on the next course I've bought, but I'm going to read this because it isn't on the next course I've bought. And you start finding that over the years, I have a copy here that, a good reference book. Every home should have a copy of this. This is the Inquiry into the Practice and Effects of Scientology. It was published by Her Majesty's Stationery Office in this country. It is a parliamentary report ordered by the House of Commons.
From what year?
It was printed on the 21st of December 1971. And it is an inquiry by a member of Parliament, Sir John G. Foster, who was a Knight of the British Empire, which is an order given by the Queen, and a reasonable rank, Sir John, therefore. He was also a Queen's Counsel, which is the top rank of trial lawyer, barrister. It is a remarkable document because he has what's called parliamentary privilege, so he can print whole documents without extracting anything. So certainly 3/4 of this 180-page report is pure L. Ron Hubbard. And then he quotes the whole policy letter. So you've got the fair game law and all sorts of things in here, which have homed in because, of course, Foster was to some extent being supplied by critics of Scientology who'd started to pull out some of these documents, and they demanded Scientology's documents, and he went through them.
Now, this is 1971 Scientology, so it did get worse after that.
There's not really any period worse than 1968 in Scientology. What was done during the overboardings, you can't swim, you're being thrown from 25 feet up, higher than the high diving board, which is about 14 feet, I think. So a dangerous, not something I would be willing to do at all.
No.
You can't swim, you're blindfolded, and your ankles are tied, and you're dropped in, bequeathed to the sea. There's even a little wording that goes,
as punishment for something trivial.
As punishment for failing to be able to define the word "and" without a pause. Because the Class 8 course, everybody had to be.
Wow.
And, the worst single punishment was the attempt to keel-haul Otto Rose on the Avon River by Mary Sue Hubbard. Put him on a rope, drag him under the keel, which should have killed him. he knew there was a rubbing strake down there, and his head would crack open like a melon on it if he didn't bounce off it with his hands. And he'd done judo, so he was able to do that. But yeah, so the things that David Miscavige has done are really quite terrible. But Hubbard for a couple of years there was really,
Yeah, well,
how it goes.
It's
so yeah. Anyway,
so
yes,
yeah. So then I researched and towards the end of my dissertation, I went to Toronto to see all those people that I've been following for all those years. What year was that?
Luminaries of your universe.
Yeah.
There's a shame Arnie wasn't there, eh?
Yeah. So what year was that conference?
It was June 2015.
Yeah. So for 18 years, I've been following Scientology, and I went to a conference with all those people that I've been reading their books.
Jerry Armstrong, yeah.
Jerry.
Tony Ortega, Steve Hassan, wow.
Yeah. Tori
Chrisman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Dan McLean,
Yeah. And the guy who did Zeno.net, the Norwegian guy.
Andreas Helder Lund.
Yeah.
Who proved to be almost as big as you.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's when I met you, and I felt because you were a celebrity in my world. So
strange thought.
Yeah.
No, you got over that fast enough.
Yeah.
And it's been very, we've talked for now 5 years, very regularly, most weeks.
Yeah.
We've traveled to 3 conferences together and had leisurely journeys on 2 of them. And we went with my boys last year to Spain on holiday, which is fantastic. And you come through here a couple of times
on my migratory route.
Yeah. And it's meant that I've had 5 years of being a sounding board for what you're thinking and what you're talking about, and gradually coming to understand parts of it along the way. And for me, this is it's a really exciting series of thoughts, because it's the missing piece. I understood peak experiences and the way that you induce peak experiences, euphoria in people, and get them where you're going. But to actually fit together the emotional part with the other parts, you're kind of going, well, this works in conversions. I have, as you know, didn't go through a conversion experience.
Yeah.
As such.
Not everybody does.
I joined. I wasn't recruited. When I didn't like it anymore, I left. Nobody abused or humiliated me. I didn't know what they were doing on the rehabilitation project force. And that was what drove me to stand up against it, that I felt guilty, that I should have known about it. Yeah. And I wanted to help, a few people at least somehow. And I was fascinated. Above all, you're finding out that you've been living in a construction, a world created by a man who is seriously ill.
Oh, yeah.
Whatever we say about Ron Hubbard, and it may be nasty, most of it, he was in a very bad way. And I take that from personal reports by, say, Jim Dinkelsey in 1972-73. Hubbard's broken his shoulder coming off a motorbike, and they take him to Queens. And I'm fairly sure that he reads Lifton there, because the Rehabilitation Project Force then suddenly issues forth. And I think that is a direct take on the methods used in China and North Korea.
That's the Scientology's punishment organization, for the people who don't know what that is.
The labor camp, the Rehabilitation Project Force, usually takes about 2 years to do. Jerry Armstrong was sent there for this sentence: "Ladies and gentlemen, now presenting," because he interviewed, something like, he impersonated a circus barker in a little film that Hubbard was making, and Hubbard took offense and thought that he was, taking the mickey out of him. So 18 months or something on the Rehabilitation Project Force. So, Strange,
Yeah.
I've always wondered why the police don't do anything about that. And the problem is people say, "Oh no, we're here. I'm chained to the boiler," because I choose to be chained to the boiler.
Yeah.
So
That's what, fascinated me so much. What the hell is going on with that?
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
my parallel is that as a teenager there were two things that particularly baffled me, and I'd focused it down into, it's happened many times, but the Nazis in Germany. How did Hitler, was it 1938, after the Anschluss, the union with Austria, there's another vote and he gets 97% of the vote, it's 90 something percent of the vote, to basically not vote again, make him president forever. And there you go. Why did people, the rest of it, the gradual takeover, the Reichstag fire, all of these, just obvious, despicable acts that put them into power. But then that Germany seemed to say, yes, this is the right thing to do. And you only get the White Rose? There's so little opposition to then the Valkyrie plot with Tom Cruise, of course.
Yeah.
Tom's favorite. Why will people accept authority in that way? So that confounded me from my team. And then I had the experience of Scientology, and I went, I think Captain Akhmedova, who is really an expert on terrorism, says that when people say, how can people be so stupid as to become terrorists? She gives them a copy of Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky. And there's even a paragraph where in the new editions, where she explains why, because it shows that somebody who at least appears to be articulate and reasonably bright can be taken in by something that's completely bonkers. It's like, I've got nowhere to hide. I did it.
Yeah.
But I was 28 when I left, so and 19 when I joined, and I'm okay. It didn't hurt me until I started talking about it, and then they spent 16 years solid harassing me. Anyway, but we'll prank John again. That'll be fun.
Yeah.
So it goes.
Yeah. So we've talked for a while, right?
Yeah.
I think
let's come to a pause. It's been fantastic talking with you, and we'll probably chop this into 150 micro segments.
Yeah.
Put it on TikTok. Anyway, I'm John Atack, and this is Yuval Laor.
You there? All right. See ya.